Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Happy to welcome you at the Women's Congress, and today we're going to speak about the role of women in peacebuilding. This is a very complicated topic and yet a very important one, especially in the frames of the event that are taking place right now. We are featuring the 20th anniversary of the UN Council Resolution, Women, Peace and Security. And that resolution highlighted the importance of the women's participation in peace building. And after 20 years since the passing of this resolution, women still do not play a significant role in the peace building process. And my name is Julia Tyczkiewska, and I will be the moderator for this panel discussion. And today we have Inna Holovanchuk, which is the Deputy Minister on Reintegration of Temporarily Occupied Territories. We have Andriy Zagorodnyuk, the Minister of Defense of Ukraine in 2019-2020. We have Anatoly Petrenko, the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine on Euro-Atlantic integration. We have Irina Gerashchenko, the MP of Ukraine. Then Olena Zakharova, the co-founder and the leader of the Center of Civil Initiatives, the Ideas of Changes. We have Osnat Lubrani, the coordinator of the UN system in Ukraine. And we have the extraordinary and plenipotentiary ambassador of Sweden to Ukraine, Tobias Tiberg, and online participants, that is the coordinator on humanitarian aspects, Rachel Agnew, and General Gordon Messenger, the representative of UK in the Consultative Council on Defense Reforms. And today we're going to talk about some of the very topical aspects of Ukraine, that is the involvement of Ukraine in the peace-building activities for temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. The first question goes to Inna Holovanchuk. Now, why do you think that it's important to engage women for peace-building process? Why is that so important? And we have a minority of women currently participating in the peace-building process in Ukraine, while at the same time, the women are the majority among the temporarily removed people. But the reintegration process is underway. And what is the current condition for those women who moved away from the eastern regions? Any programs available in support to those women? Okay, so the floor is yours. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to participate in this panel discussion, and all the experts in here are absolutely important. I would be very happy to hear some of these colleagues and these experts. And I would like to start by saying that really we are marking the 20th anniversary of the UN resolution, and it's important that Ukraine is a unique country because we have passed the implementation plan of this resolution in the course of the conflict, and I'd like to be very proud of that. But in fact, we are so unique because in 2014 we have managed to organize the intellectual and other resources to develop an action plan just before the anniversary, the 20th anniversary of this resolution. The role of my ministry is the following. Our major objective is the secure reintegration, and Alexei Reznikov, the minister, as well as the rest of the teams, they believe that secure reintegration is only possible in case of practical participation of the women in the reintegration process. We've run multiple surveys in the 21st century and the 20th century, and those surveys, they prove that whenever we have women women participating in the reintegration process, these processes are becoming much more effective. In fact, 60% more effective if the women are participating in resolving these problems. And while developing the strategy for reintegration of internally displaced persons, special attention was focused on engaging the women in the peacebuilding process and providing economic support to those women business, because we've already had a conversation, and one of the greatest challenge for the internally displaced people is the breakout of families, is the problems with the businesses, because some of the people remain on the temporarily non-controlled territories. This is a difficult fact, because in some cases we may have families where part of the family live in Donetsk, and while the other members of the family would live somewhere else. And so this provides for additional challenges to that family. These provides additional challenges for the further well-being of the family as well. And I would like to explain one aspect of the ministerial policy. I'm sure that the level of women's engagement in the peacebuilding process is not optimal, and we should really develop this process. I have no doubts that now we are having fundamental changes in our country, and therefore the engagement of women in every social aspect, including their integration, is absolutely important. Thank you, Ina. We'll go back to this topic, and now I'd like to ask the question to you, Anatoly. You are currently the Deputy Minister of Defense on European integration. You have a large experience. So what is the current situation in the armed forces of Ukraine? How many women servicemen are currently participating in the peacekeeping operations, any personnel reserve, any programs that we have in support of the women? Do we have any programs to motivate women to engage in the peacebuilding process more? So could you please tell us more? Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is truly an honor for me to join this discussion, and I believe that, first of all, we should start by expressing the words of gratitude to our women for their significant contribution to the national security and defense, particularly today, because I'm confident that our major mission and the whole peace-building process in the East, this is where we are concentrating all of our efforts and resources to ensure that we shall maintain the territorial integrity and sovereignty of our country. And over 20 years of implementation of this resolution, some significant systematic changes have taken place, particularly over the past 7 years. And my major conclusion is that our women are successful and influential, particularly in the field of national security and defense. And they are currently being selected for all types of positions at all levels, including the central command and control authorities. We have 100 women who were promoted to a rank of colonel, and I'm sure that some of them will definitely have a successful military career. And I would say that our service women have become much more professional military commanders in the armed forces. We have some successful women serving in platoons, in mortar platoons, in anti-tank platoons and companies. We have a lot of service women serving in the armed forces who demonstrate their unique leadership qualities. and they're highly respected by the other commanders and subordinates. And just yesterday, I was participating in a discussion on military political aspects of the implementation of Euro-Atlantic integration for Ukraine. Now, the group of experts, there were 11 experts. Now, out of those 11 experts, 9 were women, so this is an evidence to the fact that we have a large representation of women in that area. And we should also pay a special attention to our medical personnel, women, because we have returned a lot of them from military unit, and some of them are still serving in the armed forces, some of them are serving already as civilians, but they have managed to provide assistance and support to tens of thousands of service personnel. They're also assisting in our struggle against the pandemics. They're engaged in a lot of sanitary procedures. They're serving for the benefit of our servicemen as well as the local population in the East. And in many cases, they're the only source of qualified medical assistance in the East. We should also focus the authority of our women serving in the international peacekeeping operations, in contingents, in foreign diplomatic entities. This is where women continue to serve for the benefit of the national interests. And just as an example, in one of the most difficult stages of our confrontation with Russia, our major diplomat in Moscow was a woman, and she was very professional during that very difficult stage of our confrontation with Russia. A lot has been done. We're learning the experience, we're learning from our own, we're learning from the foreign experience, we're trying to analyze that, and I could go a lot about this, but we have started a special section in the web page of the Ministry of Defense, and this section is dedicated to the issue of women serving in the armed forces. This is one of the examples. How could you concentrate the gender issues in one aspect, in one matter? And in conclusion, I would like to provide some statistical data showing the key role which is played by the women in the national security and defense sector. In the armed forces, we have 58,000 service women, and with all due respect, this is even greater than the number of the armed forces in some of the other European countries. And today, when we have a discussion like that, 10% of the personnel serving in the East participating in the joint operation are female personnel. So we're talking about the 10,000 female personnel who performed their tasks with dignity. A lot of women personnel has received national decorations. Unfortunately, 10 of them were decorated posthumously. And despite the challenges, we still have a positive dynamics. This year only, we have signed a lot of contracts, and 70% of those women who sign contracts with the armed forces, they're serving on the command positions. We have a lot of women enrolled into the military educational institutions. Now, they will be serving as officers in the Lyceum of Bohuna in Kiev. We have already started the enrollment for girls, starting from the age of 15, and they will be learning what is necessary for their future career as an officers. So should we continue working in the systematic manner, we will have even better results through the implementation of Resolution 1325. And this would be really a comprehensive approach to have a more engagement of women in the national security and defense matters. Thank you, Anatoly. And now I'd like to ask a question to Andriy Zahorodnyuk. While you were the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, you promoted the Euro-Atlantic course of Ukraine, and you set the example of bringing the best practices, the best European practices, into the approaches to be used for the development of the defense strategy in the armed forces of Ukraine. And what do you think, with all the international experience in the area, what do you think about the engagement of women for a peace-building process? What are the perspectives? Any ideas how we can make this process even more effective? Thank you. Well, I'd like to give a few commands, very specific commands. Indeed, we've marking the 20 years anniversary of this resolution, and still we have room to develop, because the women is the largest portion of the population, and they suffer most from the international conflicts, and this is according to the statistics, while at the same time they're almost zero representation in a lot of international peacekeeping process, like 6%, 4% representation for women, very small numbers. The reason behind this is that men's starting the conflicts, they retain the monopoly for finalizing those conflicts. They are in control of the political leadership, they're in control of the military leadership, so they're not willing to give away that authority. They're trying to resolve the conflicts on their own. At the same time, women suffer most, and we have an understanding that from a psychological, financial, and economic point of view, from the point of domestic violence, in the course of these conflicts, the women really suffer the most. And why are we engaging women? Why this resolution is so important? It's revolutionary, really, and we need to implement that in Ukraine, because women, from a statistical standpoint, all the agreements reached with the participation of the women, they act for a longer period of time. There are many researchers explaining why this is happening. Besides, women raise those questions that never occur in the mindset of a man. This is why it's important. And statistically, we have most of the conflicts as the civil conflicts. We don't have a civil war, we don't have a civil conflict. We have an aggression against Ukraine on the part of Russia. So it's not the peace-building processes. It's not about the participation of the women in the peace-building process. It's about the aggressor country that we have, and this has an impact on the peace-building process. Of course, we have to engage women for all the peace-building and negotiation teams. Of course, we have to engage more women for the armed forces, and we really have a progress if compared with the previous years. This is true, and of course, we still have a lot to do, but we have a progress in that area. And I'd like to give a few examples demonstrating how women can have an impact on some of the matters that we have and some of the issues that we have in the east of Ukraine. If you take civil confrontations and civil conflicts, Ukraine had no social conflict before the war. There were no groups of citizens who were in confrontation against one another on religious background and other backgrounds. Whatever confrontations we had, it was artificial, it was created by mass media, it was an informational psychological warfare, a whole program that was developed by Russia to create an artificial conflict. And this informational psychological warfare was against the men. as if they had to take arms in their own hands and start confrontation against the legal government, while the women were left for themselves, and they preserved a solid and transparent look to what was happening. We've met many people in the villages in the east. They have a true understanding of the situation, of what's happening. They don't see any virtual things like U.S. troops or Banderivtsi or any other groups of people that just come to kill, as if told. So they go to work, they sit at home, they see what is happening around them, they can see the true things, and this is really one of the preconditions for them participating in a lot of humanitarian projects. They participate in a lot of non-governmental organizations. So speaking about the social work, they're doing much more for gluing the society than you might even think of. The other aspect is the engagement of women for civic. Then we have 15% of the women in civic units, and they have more trust. In many cases, they're not carrying weapons, so they can visit local people, and they have more trust. So Civics, there's civil-military cooperation. This is one of the best examples how the armed forces and the defense forces can maintain the peace and security on the territory which is under control of the government. Thank you, Andrei.
So, as a logical extension of this question, we'll ask Ms. Irina. You've been the presidential envoy for the peace talks in Donbass. Based on this colossal expertise and significant contributions and progress you've achieved in this position, tell us, why do you feel it's important to involve women in negotiations, in peace negotiations, in peaceful settlement of conflict? What are your prospects, given your expertise? Well, the 20th anniversary of the resolution 1353, a study was conducted, and over 40 conflicts have been analyzed since 1941. So if women were involved in peace negotiations, even in protracted conflicts of 15 or 20 years, the negotiations had a 30% better choice of a peaceful resolution. This is the reason why President Poroshenko suggested I, as a woman, become the envoy for peaceful regulation. This must be because psychologically women take this as an integral part of their life and not just as a position or a job they have to complete. And to continue on Anatoly's words, I'd like to say we have a lot to report of. We've made significant legislative breakthroughs initiated by women who have coalesced around peacebuilding. We enacted a number of laws on changing the laws on gender equality to enable women to take military specialties, better representing women in the armed forces, enabling them to make a military career and take command position, as well as a number of other laws to do with the peace settlement. That is civil demining, law on those missing in action. We enacted it jointly with the International Expert and International Red Cross Committee. Is proud to say that Ukraine is the only country in the world to enable this law at the time of a hot armed conflict. This law had to do with the payments to the families of those taken hostage. And we enable a law on the status of hostages, prisoners of war. It was enacted in the first reading by the previous parliament, but unfortunately the current parliament has blocked it for already a year and a half, and I feel that the parliament instead should be pushing these processes forward. As for the executive government, we are proud to say that women, including myself, initiated and pushed the Ministry for Reintegration and the Ministry for the Veteran Affairs. It was led by a woman. We had serious discussion amongst the veterans, saying that it was a veteran who had to take the ministerial position. But we felt that first an enabler of the institution should start and then hand it over to the veterans. And I would say that this summer we had a special event where the special forces invited 4 women to their special day as the enablers, that you made it possible to enact this law. And it was a very moving moment, like your child's birthday. An area that I dedicated my energies to most was the work of the humanitarian group in Minsk and the peace settlement processes in the Donbass. I made scores of trips to the Donbass. I made scores of visits to attend in Minsk, and we liberated hundreds detained and imprisoned, including women. So those who've been held prisoners of war, who've been through the atrocities, those people have to be involved in peace regulation, but also in inclusive negotiations, the search for an inclusive dialogue. Unfortunately, the current government isn't using this opportunity. As an envoy for regulation, I kept in constant touch with the families of the hostages, with their mothers and wives, and that's great potential that is most empowering, but also it gave me a lot of transformative power. So, unfortunately, today, those women who had great faith in Ukraine, believing that Ukraine will never leave its own behind, are not being brought on board. Another platform that's unfortunately been abandoned by the current government, which was very constructive, that was the informal Minsk platform created in Parliament, formed in my initiative. Within this platform, I brought together representatives of all factions, though even who felt very adversely towards Minsk process and Minsk Accords. However, it was an important platform to report on the progress, report on the action taken, and see if we could find common ground. This platform brought together all the OSCE coordinators and Minsk group delegates. We made it a learning ground to learn from the countries who had parallel or similar experience of internal conflict, but we learned about them, about amnesty, peacekeeping, demining operations, peacebuilding operations. In particular, we met Croatian delegates, the Minister for Reintegration from Croatia, and we learned from the Irish experience, Colombian experience, and it was most valuable to help the members of parliament find common ground. Now there are women represented in Minsk group. Helena Titikova heads the specialized committee on social policy, and she is involved in the humanitarian group and is taking care of the liberation of hostages. But why is her voice so weak? Why is there so little known about what they do? Why do we know so little about what's going on in Minsk groups? Sometimes we learn about it from the Russian sources or from some separatist platforms. That's unacceptable. And it's not a problem of women involved in the groups, but of the government perhaps not empowering the women, not enabling the women. And to end on a positive note, I would say it's very important for the country to know its success stories of the women who were involved in peace-building processes. And I'd like to give an example of Yulia Lapunina. That's the second general woman from the Security Service Ukraine. A few will know that Miss Yulia was a great trainer for men and women at the breakout of the war to protect the sovereignty of the country, but also she demonstrated unique negotiatory practices during the liberation of Kramatorsk in the early days. making sure that the conflicts are eliminated on the social level after the liberation. And there were many women like that, like Inna Dolgin, who was liberated from being held hostage, and now she is representing Ukrainian interests abroad, where her experiences are studied, and there is so much Ukrainian women contribute in the inclusive processes. This formation of role models is very important and critical, in fact. This is the best incentive for systemic change, but the time is fleeting. I'd like to remind everyone who is following our conversation online that you can pose your questions. We will leave some time to field them, but now I'd like to pose a question to Ms. Olena. As a representative of the civil society sector of this wonderful panel, please tell us how you perceive the problem of effective involvement of women as a civil society activist. What's your role? We'd like to hear your say on this. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this focus that's given at this event. The peace negotiations are political in their nature. It's not something mundane that happens during a war on conflict, but still it's a political process, and we should take it as such. We are not surprised by the 40% quota of women who have to be listed by the political parties running for elections. That's become part of everyday life. Soon this quota will be 15%, hopefully. The same quota should be applied to other decision-making processes, policy-making processes, and peace negotiations. There's no requirement for the gender quotas for peace talks, but it can be a commitment taken on voluntarily, and it's a message to those drawing the negotiation list. It's addressed to the President, the Presidential Office, but also to the Ministry of Reintegration. When the internally displaced persons were involved in the negotiations, there were 4 of them who were involved, all men. While the question we should ask, don't we have professional women in civil society who have been internally displaced, who've long worked to regulate the conflict, who've long worked to reduce the aftermath of the conflict? Surely this is something that never occurred to those drawing the list, that they had to strike a gender balance. Surely we have qualified women who could make a valuable contribution. When the delegations are drawn, they're usually based on the posts held by the candidates. So that is a broader question then, addressed to the government about the women involved in decision-making. It's a comprehensive question then. We need to see that women have to be proportionally represented in all political processes, including peace negotiations. But the numbers aren't the panacea, aren't the cure-all, as we've seen from a number of studies. The numbers don't always bring the qualitative change. We need to see why we involve women in negotiations. We do that to add an additional perspective that can be missed out in the context where women are left out. The peace negotiations are always politically driven by the issues of national security and defense. And without overlooking them, we might neglect the issues of security of the people, issues that people face in the area of conflict, in the areas that is not in governmental control, adding a human perspective. If you could perhaps comment on the way the civic activists could be involved in peace negotiations. I would say we have to define the objective, why we would bring them on board, and then think of a mechanism, how to. If we take Georgia as an example, we would see that the Geneva negotiators who take part in regulation of conflict in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, prior to the debates, have to meet the women's organizations of internally displaced persons for consultations. That obligation is enshrined in the National Plan for the Implementation of the Resolution 1353. Thank you, Ms. Olena. Now, we have a good opportunity to learn about other international practices. I'd like to give the floor to the Commander, Rachel Aglu.
Hello, it's a big pleasure you joining us for this conversation, Commander and
I'm delighted to be able to join you today.
Messenger.
As a former
I would like to ask
in warfighting and peace support operations, I have a positive personal story. I had a gender equal experience in the military career, which started at a time when women did not serve at sea and finished at a time when women were driving ships, flying attack helicopters and fighter jets. However, for a decade now, I've worked for the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Efforts as a specialist humanitarian civil military negotiator or coordinator. I am all too aware of the inequalities that women face war and the positive impact in a conflict where only exist. Leading on the Interagency Standby Committee Gender and Protection capacity a number of years ago, I know that conflict is very unequally weighted against women and girls, and we heavily promoted the analysis of sex and age disaggregated data and the use of the gender marker or the representation for humanitarian programming so that we could encourage the right story to be told. What became a depressing quote in my unit, which was what the other 50% of the community think. Regrettably, despite the data showing us that women's inclusion in peace building is essential for long and lasting change, calls for meaningful women's participation still do go unanswered. In the forum today, we know the appalling statistic that from 92 until last year, 13% of negotiators, 6% of mediators, and 6% of signatories in the peace process were women. However, in my experience, there are some very strong, successful examples of engagement with women and successful contributions of women in peace building. One from my most recent experience in Syria is the Syrian Women's Advisory Board, Raja Atali, who began documenting human rights violations in 2011. Although reporting on human rights violations against men and women and boys and girls, she filled a space that had previously been there by enabling women to speak to other women. She went on to co-found an NGO to strengthen community engagement for women, never excluding men, but believing that the more visible her work became, then the more that this brought women in. She and many other women fought internally for the 30% of representation at the Syria Constitutional Commission, and that will draft the new constitution, meaning that the Women's Advisory Board pushed to prioritise the participation of women, and this has been an excellent mechanism, a pioneering mechanism to galvanise action for peace. Another positive example sticks in my head is in Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland Women's Coalition did not wait to be asked but decided amongst themselves to put their own voice forward. Women on both sides of the divide came together and organised themselves and unified themselves before that they went into the peace process, showing that they. So they played a very effective part in the Good Friday negotiations, and note the fact that the.
We have a question to General Gordon Messenger. Recently, the General Secretary of UN mentioned that the direct involvement of women in peace negotiation is non-debatable, and men have to play a more active role in the process to break this vicious circle, to break the rejection circle. So in your opinion, based on your extensive background, how should the process be designed to more effectively involve women in peace building? Please.
Well, thank you very much, firstly, for inviting me to talk on such an important issue. I retired about a year ago as the Vice Chief of Defence Staff for the United Kingdom, and in that role I was the 1325 envoy and spent some time establishing a Chief of Defence women's network, which many Chiefs of Defence around the world signed up to. Every Chief of Defence Staff around the world, by the way, being a man. So that I think says something in itself. Why do I view this so strongly? Why am I so committed to it? Well, in my 40-year military career, as Rachel just said, I think that 50% of the population in conflict and in peace negotiation are underrepresented and exploited, and we have to do better. I think there are three things that international experience tells us need to happen, and much has been covered already. I think the first is that women need to be at the negotiating table. Both a couple of speakers have talked about the chances of success improving if that is the case. I think more accurately, perhaps we should say, in the negotiating room, because I've been privy to peace negotiations in Syria and in Afghanistan, and in both cases it was almost always men around the table. But what was of note was that behind them and their principal advisors and the people that they turned to when key decisions needed to be made were the large proportion of women. And so I think there's something in that we need to reflect the society. It's about getting the voice and becoming an important part of the decision making. But that's just at the very top. What needs to happen is that gender awareness and women's issues need to be infused throughout the conflict resolution model and the peacekeeping that is associated with it. We need more women peacekeepers on the ground. The United Nations have rightly set targets, but they're low. And of course, we're blighted by the fact that there simply aren't enough women proportionally in most militaries around the world. Certainly in my country, we're at about 11–12%, and that's just unacceptably low. And we really need to work hard at getting that higher, particularly because more and more roles in military are absolutely doable by women as well as men. But you also need to have a model for their employment. And again, the United Nations are leaning heavily into female engagement teams. I know from my experience when I was in charge of UK troops in Afghanistan that we were simply not getting access to 50% of the Afghan population on area because we didn't have enough women on the ground. So they can be a really important conduit to what's going on the ground. And again, that is underrepresented. I think we should also be looking for role models in the society, women role models, leaders, local and national. And again, my experience in Afghanistan was that some of the most impressive local leaders were women. They were smaller in number, but they were by far and away the most impressive, probably because of all the barriers that they had to go through to get to that position. And civil society has such a strong voice, and if a commander on the ground or the operational model doesn't and can't engage with civil society in that area, then it is just missing such an opportunity for feel on the ground, but also vital input as we start to head towards a resolution. And the third practice is that
thank you, General. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you for your commands. It was very good to hear about the perspective, and this is really words in support to the movement that Ukraine is taking, and this is something absolutely important, as we need to create certain examples in our society. And speaking about the role models, Sweden here is the country which is among the top 5 countries with the best index of gender gap, which is published annually by the Economic Forum. Besides, Sweden is among those countries which is decisively trying to make sure that women are engaged in all spheres of decision-making process. Your Excellency, Ambassador, it would be great to hear some of your commands as your country shall have a chairmanship in the European Council next year, and you've already declared that women, peace and security is the priority for you. Why is this agenda so important for your country, for yourself personally, and what are going to be some of your priorities while chairmanship in the Council?
Thank you so much, Julia. 3 reasons why we think it's important. Number 1, values. It's really not credible to say that we care about human rights if we don't address the fact that half of the world's population have unequal access to their rights, to political representation, and to resources. So values. Second reason, law. There's a Security Council Resolution 1325. That means that it's an international obligation for Sweden as a member state of the UN and for all 57 participating states of the OSCE to work seriously with 1325. So we have a legal obligation. And the third issue is effectiveness. And I'm not going to repeat all the arguments. Inna's made it, Andrei has made it. We know that peace agreements which involve women are not only more likely to last, but equally important, they're more likely to generate economic development and to reduce poverty after the peace agreement is signed. So I would actually like to suggest, Julia, that the question you posed to me is the wrong one. The question shouldn't be, why are we prioritizing this? The question should be, how on earth could we not prioritize this? Now, just a few comments on the Ukrainian context in view of our chairpersonship. Ina's here today. Your boss, Deputy Prime Minister Reznikov, has shown ambition, imagination, and courage in how he wants to deal with this conflict on behalf of the Ukrainian leadership. You've set very high goals for yourself. You have come up with imaginative ideas and tactics of how to deal with the conflict, and you're courageous in your willingness to look at the most sensitive and most difficult aspects of this conflict. So what does that mean in terms of 1325? 2 things, I would say. Number 1, looking at the negotiating delegation, you have reimagined the Ukrainian negotiating delegation. You have included Ukrainians who've been displaced from parts of Ukraine which are currently under occupation. You have included faith leaders. You have included media. You have included members of parliament. So you have a negotiating team which shows the diversity of Ukrainian society in a way which is an extremely powerful contrast in view of the Russian negotiating delegation, which is on the other side in the trilateral contact group. And I think this is an incredibly important and powerful testament of the kind of European democratic society Ukraine is. So the first thing I would like to encourage is that when you reimagine this negotiating team, don't forget the 50% of Ukraine who are women. The second point I'd like to make, because you said it, which I think is important, Deputy Minister, you said that it's not only about signing a peace agreement, it's about secure reintegration. Now, secure reintegration, as Andriy also pointed out, needs to take account of the experiences, of the ideas, of the initiatives, of the proposals of people who are actually on the ground. Olena is here today. She's one of incredibly many representatives of Ukrainians living on both sides of the occupation line in eastern Ukraine. Unless their experiences are taken into account, I don't think that resilience, which is the purpose of secure reintegration, will actually happen. And why is that resilience so important? It's important because after the deal has been signed, a resilient eastern Ukraine will be so much more powerful in terms of withstanding the kind of external aggression which has resulted in the conflict in Ukraine today. So I think there's two very powerful things that can be done. We, as chairperson of the OSCE in 2021, will do everything we can to support Ukraine in those efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you for the support in these important processes. And another question I have to Ambassador Umbrani. And you as the representative, the coordinator for the UN in Ukraine, how do you see the possible assistance and support from the UN to this greater purpose of increasing, of empowering women in peace-building processes? From your perspective, taking into consideration your experience, what are some of the advices or commands, or maybe systematic commands that you could provide to that aspect? But please be concise and be short. We have very large questions from our auditorium. Please.
Thank you so much. There's so much that's been said, but maybe just to say it's great to be here 20 years. I was there in New York when we were fighting to get this into the Security Council. So a lot has happened, and we heard it today. I want to maybe remind you that I'm also the humanitarian coordinator of the United Nations. And in that role, I go to both sides of the contact line. We work very closely also with the defense forces, and particularly civil-military cooperation, as you mentioned, is so important. But invariably, it's the women who suffer the most, and it is also the women who are keeping the societies together. And I really think that the leadership is there. It's just that it's not being taken into consideration. It doesn't have voice enough. And so I think some of the ideas that were mentioned here are extremely important. The role of civil society to really help be that connector, and having a government really listen to these voices. It's not only about the numbers of how many sit there, but also when the peace negotiations are written, there's the gender perspective about how to prevent the conflict, what needs to be done on issues such as gender-based violence, and that those aspects as well are extremely important. So I think for the United Nations, yes, it was mentioned, we do have, and we heard today from the external speakers, we do have quotas. The Secretary General, very committed, takes this issue about parity within the UN on the highest positions. We are trying, but to the extent that a country like Ukraine still has low women's political participation, low participation in law enforcement or in defense forces, then our peacekeeping missions are also suffer from a gender imbalance, and it becomes very challenging. So I would say also for Ukraine as a troop contributing country to the peacekeeping missions, it's very important to get more women in the military and in police missions. And I think there is, as we heard, a lot of progress. The fact that Ukraine adopted a national action plan on 1325, now the second one, is great. So you have have these things going. Great opportunities now that the chairmanship of Sweden is coming in to take this issue, and certainly you have full support from UN Women, from other UN agencies here in Ukraine to continue doing that work and supporting the government, the Ministry of Reintegration, and working with the civil society, of course, very important.
Thank you for your contribution. We have a number of questions from the audience, and I'll be addressing them to all the speakers. Those willing to answer them concise, please give any sign and provide a concise answer. So when do we have a military uniform specifically for service women? I guess this is the question more to you, Mr. Anatoly. Well, this is not only the question to when do we have a military uniform for service women. Well, it's not an issue of existence, it's a question about development, because we already have a military uniform for women servicemen. And when we were talking about the legislation and equal opportunities for education, training, military career, what is also important is logistical support. Considering the special needs, there has to be also a special social package which do account for the important role played by the women, and really these money are always provided for in the budget. And whenever we're talking about the military uniform, this is exactly the case when we should have proper resources allocated. We know and we pay special attention to this issue, and currently there is an order of the Minister of Defense that sets out clear standards for female military uniform, for combat operations, for everyday activity. Okay, we have a number of questions for you as well, but I'd like to other colleagues to join the conversation as well. Then about sexual violence and psychological pressure on the service personnel, the women service personnel. And the question is, why do those questions are discussed with public organizations only? Let's have it like that. And you've already mentioned this. Are there any amendments to the internal regulations, or what is the stage for the development of the draft law that could regulate these painful issues? Well, zero tolerance, that's the first issue I want to underline. And considering the equal rights and possibilities, there is no difference, absolutely, in the consideration of those issues by the military leadership or by the political leadership whenever those cases really occur. And I can tell you that we immediately respond to any signals or any even hints of such a misdemeanor. So only in the sound teams and sound body that is acting as a unified agency, only that agency will have a success. And that is why we have to be more sort of brave in striping out of these stereotypes. Maybe the next question we have, when do we have a woman appointed as the Minister of Defense? Well, just recently we had a woman as the Deputy Minister of Defense, so it's a question of time, really. And I'd also like to comment on the previous questions. In the armed forces, we had 250,000 service personnel, but the level of direct access of the servicemen to the leadership is the best, because we had many information that was promptly reported to the leadership on any violations in the armed forces, sometimes from the civil organizations, sometimes from the servicemen themselves. So whenever something happened during the day, we would have the information on that at night or in the evening. So the leadership of the Ministry Ministry of Defense and the General Staff, they can respond very fast to any of such misdemeanor. And in my time and position, I had to respond to several cases like that. Just wanted to say that.
Оборони. Мені здається, що питання не тільки в тому, коли вона буде, а щоб взагалі у влади змінювалося ставлення.
It's not a question when will we have the first Minister of Defense, but also a number of women in government and their say in the decision-making. Now, in the Ukrainian parliament, we have a record number of women, but I can't say that women have particular access to decision-making. Now we have a unique situation when a woman representing an opposition faction is the acting chairwoman of the parliament, and this is a best example of women leadership, but I'd like the women who are chairing the committees now, who are involved in the Minsk negotiation processes, to be better heard. And then we'll mature to 11 when the government will accept that a woman heading a defense ministry, now she has to be civilian, to dispel the common myth, is a very good idea, and she would serve her country well. Thank you, Irina. Thanks to all the panelists for their very good contribution to this difficult topic. We had Inna Holovachuk, Deputy Minister for Reintegration of Temporarily Occupied Territories, and Liza Horodnyuk, Minister of Defense of Ukraine for 2019 and 20, Anatoly Petrenko, Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine for European Integration, Irina Gerashchenko, MP of Ukraine, Olena Zakharova, co-founder and manager of the Civics initiatives, Idea of Change, Ms. Osnat Lubrani, coordinator for the UN system in Ukraine, His Excellency Tobias Tibek, extraordinary and plenipotentiary ambassador of Sweden to Ukraine. We had Rachel Naglu, coordinator for humanitarian issues of the UN, and General Gordon Messenger, representing the UK in the DRAB board. Thanks, everyone, for your contributions, for leading us by example, for drawing our attention to the role of women in peacebuilding. I'd like to thank the organizers of the 4th Ukrainian Women's Congress who are raising these issues, because all changes start with in-depth discussion, with articulating the challenges we are facing. Thanks to the partners for their support, for enabling the 4th Ukrainian Women's Congress. Together, let's build a society to live in. Thank you.